Hi everybody, my name is Andrew Oppmann. I'm Vice President for Marketing and Communications at Middle Tennessee State University. But I'm doing this video today in my role as a volunteer for Civil Air Patrol. And joining me is Lieutenant Colonel Morgan Torp-Pedersen, who is the Public Affairs Officer for Tennessee Wing, and also this year's National PAO of the Year. Welcome, Morgan.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So Morgan and I were scheduled to make a presentation to the Public Affairs Officers Academy at the National Conference. We are unable to attend, so this video is going to take the place of our presentation. We're going to weave in the PowerPoint that I was going to show, and we're going to have a discussion about it. And hopefully we'll be able to capture some of the key points that we were hoping to convey to you in person and have a little discussion about some do's and don'ts and some tips about media writing. The biggest message I wanted to get across to everybody is that media writing is not that hard. Sometimes we really make it into something extremely difficult. We really do. We make it into, you know, we're going to produce lines of Shakespeare or really long things where you have to tell your PAOs, sometimes it's just telling a story, right? Just keeping it simple.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and so what we're going to do is we're going to walk you through some strategies on how to keep it simple and how to organize your thinking about putting together a news story so it can be done very quickly and easily. Now, if there's an evil maniacal goal in any of this, we also want to encourage you to take greater advantage of cap.news, the online digital news platform of Civil Air Patrol. If you produce more stories that are suitable not only for distribution to your media, but also cap.news, we all win. So, all right, let's just get down to it. When we talk about media writing not being so hard, Morgan, we're really talking about the 5 W's and the 1 H, the who, what, when, where, why, and how. And sometimes really I think that's the hardest thing that we have to keep reminding people about, but when you're in the business, it's the simplest thing, right? It really gets down to the point. Mm-hmm. When you're working with PAOs, walk me through, you know, how do you help them identify what is a news story? How do you help them get to that?
Well, sometimes I know people find it difficult. Is their story newsworthy enough? Something as simple as a promotion ceremony, a change of command, just making sure that they know that everything that they're doing is newsworthy and that it is able to be published and it's not that difficult to write it as they might think it is.
It's telling your story, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, and when you talk about it not being so difficult, it's really just getting it into a form that's easy to read and easy to write. And that's one of the things we're going to talk about in this PowerPoint. 5 W's and 1 H, how to identify what they are. We'll talk a little bit about news values, some of the stuff that Morgan was mentioning. We'll talk about something called the inverted pyramid, which is a fun way that journalists organize their thinking and their writing so that it's easy to read and easy to edit. And we'll cover a few basics of Associated Press style. Now, when we're talking about keeping it simple, we're talking about really getting to the point quickly. That means short words, short sentences, getting to the point quickly, and using as few words as possible. And a lot of times, if you really dissected an effective news story that you're reading on a digital platform like your smartphone, it's really 5 or 7 sentences long is a really effective short news story. And typically that's one thought per paragraph. And if you really dig down into those paragraphs, you're really discovering it's one sentence per paragraph. So it's a single sentence that really puts together a paragraph in news writing. I mean, Morgan, you've read news stories from your phone, right? You know, what's
right.
One of the advantages of keeping them short is if it's a long sentence, what does it do? It fills up the whole screen, right?
So it makes the story seem larger than it is, but then it also, for people that aren't necessarily as patient, you can scroll through it quickly.
It looks like a dense piece of type, and I don't have the time to read through that. But you write a short sentence, it helps break up the monotony of the type. It doesn't look as intimidating, and it really kind of gets to the point. Now, if you're only going to do a 7-sentence story, a couple of those things need to be great quotes, right? Mm-hmm. Talk to me about when you're coaching people through finding a good quote. What is a great quote in your estimation?
So it depends on the story. So if it's a promotion ceremony where a cadet is maybe getting their spots, talking about their time and value that they've had in the program, just kind of questions that will make them interactive with you so that they know that they don't have to come up with a quote, but if they just start talking to you and have a conversation, you can typically pull things from that. Even a change of command ceremony, get a quote from the outgoing and incoming commander for maybe thoughts from the incoming commander or goals that they have for the new squadron, or from the outgoing commander, just ideas and kind of thanking everybody for things. So just getting everybody's feelings and emotions attached to that.
You know, Morgan, you've really gotten to the point of it. A quote is really conveying a sense of emotion. In other words, it's going to give me a voice in what someone is saying and feeling more than what I can do, because I'm a detached third-person writer. If I'm writing a traditional news story, I'm not in the story. So I shouldn't be telling you how terrific something is. But I can quote the wing commander, the region commander, the squadron commander, say, yeah, this is a meaningful event for our squadron. They can tell that emotions. So when we're doing short sentences, and I talk about how short a sentence is, I'm really only talking about between 25 and 40 words. If you can get it down to less than 25 words and still have it make sense, that's fabulous. But usually you need enough runway, but about 25 to 40 words to have a complete thought in there. And again, most paragraphs in media writing are a single sentence. And if a sentence is 25 to 40 words, you really get a sense of really how simple it is to put together a basic news story. And sometimes we overcomplicate it by making it too long and really overwriting for the situation that we're trying to cover. So when you're writing a longer story, if you need to get into the nitty-gritty details of something, you can go a little bit deeper and longer than 5 to 6 paragraphs. But really start thinking about those first 5 paragraphs and how you can tell the story effectively in those paragraphs. And Morgan, that's really just getting to the point fast, right?
Right.
Why am I going to read this? And that, a lot of that comes from the discussion you have with PAOs before the fact, or with anybody before the fact. What are you going to write about, right? What's going to be up at the top? What do you have any, when you're talking to people or coaching them through certain things, do you help kind of coax that out of them?
Yeah, I think sometimes for people that may be newer to the public affairs position, or even if you've written several stories, kind of pulling that creativity out is sometimes difficult. So just making sure you kind of walk through them, just the beginning steps, and making sure that they are keeping it short, but attention grabbing and just newsworthy. Back
when I was a city editor and I worked at newspapers, I always asked my reporter, why am I going to read the story? What are you going to tell me? You know, too often we back into stories rather than saying at the very front, in the very first sentence, what it's all about. So that kind of gets us back to the 5 W's and the 1 H. 5 W's, who, what, when, where, and why. And the 1 H is the how. And really, if you only remember one thing from this presentation, remember this. If your first 5 graphs, if the story you put together doesn't answer as many of those questions that can be answered, particularly the who, what, when, then you probably don't have a news story. If you can't answer those fundamental questions, it's hard sometimes to get to the why, because sometimes things happen and you don't know why.
Right.
and then sometimes you can't get to the how, because you may not understand how it happened. But you've got to at least say who's involved, right? What happened? When did it happen? And where is an important part of that. Let's talk about the when for a second, because sometimes we're sending out we're sending mixed messages about the when. Sometimes we want something immediately, right? News has a certain currency, want it now. And sometimes PAOs get a little bit hesitant because, oh gosh, I can't get that out tomorrow, so I'm not going to be able to do that.
Right.
But our news doesn't always have that expiration date on it, right?
And even if it's something that happened maybe earlier in the week, just say in a recent event, so it's still current, but you don't have to give it necessarily a date or time frame that it happened, just making sure that it is kind of timely for when it's distributed, but recent is an easy word to use that talks about it.
Right, it covers a lot. So let's, like a change of command of a squadron commander. Sure, perfect world, it'd be great if you got that out in 5 hours, but the reality is, as long as it gets out recently, and I define that within a week, 10 days maybe, enough where you can say recent and you feel justified that it is truly recent.
Right.
It will be news to whoever reads it at that time, right? But there are also some times where immediacy counts, right? I'm thinking about some SARXs that you and I have been...
missions,
missions, that if a mission press release or an event press release comes out and it is 2 weeks later, what happens?
Yeah, especially with the timeliness of maybe a downed aircraft or something similar to that capacity, you don't really have the time to get it out 2 weeks later. And that's also another example of a why. You have to be careful what you say in that instance, because sometimes if it's a downed aircraft or a missing person or, I mean, we don't necessarily know the causes for things.
Right.
To assume or to put our opinions in for why something might have happened is something that they're going to want to be careful of.
Absolutely, absolutely. So when we're talking about the often conflicting messages, there are some elements to our news that really, as long as you get it out within spitting range, you're okay. But when we're in a mission mode, there are obviously a lot of pressures.
Right.
The IC's got to see it. Sometimes it has to go to national. Definitely sometimes it needs to go through the wing PAO.
Right.
So you're not going to be in a situation where you can wait, but you also have to have caution because the right people have to approve it.
Right.
So I guess if there's a message in any of this is that you've got to know the circumstance. If you've got a story that doesn't have that sense of urgency, you've got a little time, as long as you feel like it's recent. If it's got a really sharp sense of when, and it happened today, reporters are knocking on the door, there's a whole different set of guidelines that probably fall more into the PIO part of a discussion, which could be another lecture for another conference at another time. So let's go to this. So if you can't identify what makes your story unique and interesting, the chances are nobody else will either. And on the slide you're going to see on the screen in front of you, we're going to walk through a few of those things. When we talk about who, we're talking about who is driving the story. Who is it about? Who is affected? Who benefits from it, and who loses? When we talk about the what has happened? What are the consequences, and what does it mean for the reader? When we talk about the where, this is really where it's happening. The building, the neighborhood, the city, the country, the squadron. The when, well, you know, the time of day, the day, the month, the year. Not that all that needs to be in that one sentence. You don't need to be that precise sometimes. But the truth is, I need to have at least a feel from this to give me a sense of context of, did this happen within the last few days? Is this something that's really ancient history? The more immediate, the more current it feels, the greater traction it's going to have as a news story. Then finally, why? Why does this event take place? Why is this important to the big picture? And why should readers care? And then my poor lonely how. How did this happen? How will it happen? Sometimes you don't know. So Morgan, we're going to go through some of the stuff that we've done, our Hurricane Matthew stuff. And some of our colleagues may be in the audience. If you are, hello, and we love you. But we're going to show an example of something that came out of the Florida wing with Hurricane Irma and really dissect a few of those things. So if you look at the screen, this is a story from Captain Castleman of the Civil Air Patrol's Florida wing. And this is a great example of the top of a story, the who, what, when, where, why, and how. So the who in this case, Civil Air Patrol's Florida wing. The what? Well, they finished moving its aircraft from Tallahassee to Punta Gorda in Orlando to be positioned for the missions. When did they do it? This week. Where? Tallahassee to Punta Gorda. And why? To be positioned for the additional missions. And so Morgan, that's an example of a single sentence where we've managed to answer all 5 of the questions. If you were in my class, that'd be Captain Castleman would have got an A for that because you've got a lot happen. Sometimes you're not going to be able to do that, but if you can, as many of those things as you can answer at the top of the sentence, the first sentence of the story, the better. Say an amen to that and tell me why that's important to get to the point quickly.
I think it's important because you want to put the most important items up at the top because it'll make the reader continue reading, or if that's all they have time for, they've read the key facts.
That's exactly right. In a nutshell, Morgan's doing a better job of this presentation than I am. If you don't get the news up high, people aren't just going to understand, well, why am I taking the time to do this? What's the point of this? And she's also right. I might get enough information out of the first paragraph of this story where I don't need to read any further because you've told me everything I need to know. News writing is often trying to make the best use of your time as a reader, and getting to the point quickly helps you and also gives you the option. If you need to go deeper, you can, but I got the point by reading that first sentence. Know how. I forgot to click on that button.
Lonely
There was
how.
my lonely how. All right. This is another one from our hurricane coverage, this one from the Montgomery Advertiser. I think this was a team effort, so there's no byline on it. So the who in this case, the last 6 members. What? Well, they returned. The what is usually your verb. When? Thursday. Where? Over the Virgin Islands. Why? After assisting the organization's Puerto Rico wing. Is there a how? Not really. Morgan, I think this was some folks from your wing were involved in this. Hey, by background, I don't think I introduced myself properly. I serve as Public Affairs Officer for the Southeast Region Wing. That's why Morgan and I are
Right.
swapping hurricane stories because we're in the middle of that. So, you know, we were on a different operational tempo with this. We were trying to get the news out pretty quickly. And there was a lot of pressure in that. And, you know, one of the things of looking back at that we had a hard time doing, there's so many things happening, is picking the thing that we're going to put in the lead. So Morgan, when you're approaching a story like this, you've got a lot of things going on, and you've got to pick between multiple competing elements. How do you pick the thing to put at the top of the story?
You're going to look for the thing that reaches the most people.
That connects with them, right? That they that can pull together enough of an audience to go, wow, okay, this touched, affected, impacted the most people. And in this case, this was our team moving and getting ready to come back from those missions. There was really a lot of folks involved in that. So I work with a guy at MTSU named Dr. Kim Blake, and if he sees this online, I have to give him a shout out. He is my mentor in teaching in the School of Journalism and Strategic Media at Middle Tennessee State University. And I give him proper credit, but man, I use his stuff in my class. And these are, I'm going to go through Dr. Blake's 6 rules for writing a news story. And you're going to see it on the screen. It should go pretty quickly, but I just want to reinforce a couple of things. First rule, a straight news lead should be a single paragraph, summarize at most the what, where, and when of a story. I would throw in the who if you know the who in that situation. In most cases, if you can't answer those questions high up in the story, if not the first paragraph, then you may not have a story. And when I do say lead, I should make sure that everybody understands, because I'm lapsing back into my old newspaper terminology. The lead is the first sentence of a news story. So on the screen, you're going to see an example here of how Dr. Blake's rule here applies to an example. Fire destroyed a house on Main Street early Monday morning. That's a single sentence. It's just 10 words, and that's very, very good. You know, when I say 25 to 40, there's typically enough runway to do more, but if you can get it done in less without making the reader feel like they're missing something, go for it. The word count includes little words like a and on. You got to make sure that there's no perfect system, so you got to count the big words as much as the small words. It summarizes the main what of the story. A fire destroyed the house. The where is Main Street, and the when is early Monday morning. So simple, gets the job done. But you may have more information that you want to try to get into that lead, and you may have a little extra space because you've only used 10 words. So we're going to unwind some of those things in these other parts of Dr. Blake's rules. Second rule, make sure the main what of the story is within the first 7 words. Now, when I say 7, I'm not really talking, if it needs to be 6 or 8, 7's a goal. Okay. Morgan's giving me that look. Okay. So fire destroyed a house on Main Street early Monday morning. Destroyed is the main what of the story. It's the lead's second word. And it puts it well in front of the street, which is the 7th word. You know, there are no other verbs in front of that destroyed because the house is destroyed, right? Fire destroyed a house. Even if you didn't read any more, where or when, you know something's happened, right?
Right.
So the third rule, the first verb, the same one that expresses the what, should be an active voice, not passive voice. And Morgan, I got to tell you, when I'm coaching new PAOs and new writers in my days, sometimes people want to back into the story, and that's usually they're using passive words. It's sort of like they don't want to say something directly. They'll kind of couch it. Have you noticed that too?
Yeah, I've seen that sometimes where maybe they aren't aware of how to, start it, so then they try to just
yeah,
make
they
it
kind
flow
of.
on their own.
It's almost like you're being a little tentative. And instead of a house was destroyed by fire, fire destroyed a house.
Right.
Fire is the active voice. Destroyed connects with the word fire, and it basically says this fire did something. And a passive way to do that would be a house was destroyed by fire, as I mentioned before. Fire is the action point. It did it to the house. The house received the action. So follow the action. You usually can figure out how to do this. So it wouldn't be a new squadron commander was named and he or she is blank. It would
Right.
be Major Jane Smith became the new squadron commander
Right.
or was appointed, named, promoted. Better verb than became. Number 4 rule, if there's a who involved in the story, the lead should give some indication of who the who is. Thank you very much. So if you know who it is, it's good to basically give you some indication of who the who is. So it would be, so let's use the squadron commander thing that we're talking about philosophically. A Murfreesboro executive has been named the new commander of the Southeast region. Not that that's ever going to happen to me, folks, but that gives at least some quantification of,
Right.
rather than a man, right?
And it's more grabbing and it makes you want to read the story.
Hones in a little bit more, gives you a little bit more information. So in this case, the example that's on the screen, an elderly Anytown man died Monday when an early morning fire raged through his Main Street home. The who is the elderly Anytown man. In this case, the who isn't someone that people would instantly recognize, so it's okay to characterize him as an elderly man in this case, as long as later in the story you say who he is. That's called a blind lead, and you do have to give that name later in the story. But the flip side example of that is when you know the person, right? So it's one thing if your wing, a member gets honored, but if the wing commander gets honored,
Right.
you say that, right? Because we know who the wing commander is, our audience, or theoretically maybe even others in the community know who that person is.
Exactly.
Be more specific if that person you feel kind of rises to above the standing of just ordinary folks like you and me. Us poor PAOs, we're always in the background. We're never the focus of the story. But in this case, the example, the mayor, Anytown mayor died in that fire. Well, that's a bigger deal. The mayor died in that fire. Rather
Right.
than just anybody, it was the mayor. The mayor is someone that people recognize. The lead gives his name because his name is part of that news. 5th rule, the lead should summarize the why and the how of the story, but only if there's room. And this is an example that Dr. Blake provides. An elderly Murfreesboro man died Monday morning when fire sparked by faulty wiring raged through his Main Street home. So if you count this up, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. That's compelling video, folks. 21 words. So we still have plenty of runway, but we were able to get in some of the why in this when we knew it and still be able to get to the point. So the 6th rule, whatever is in the lead, if it can be attributed, attribute it. Attribute it means tell your source.
Right.
So I always put that caveat with the asterisk you'll see on the screen, unless it doesn't feel right. If you feel it just grows the story or grows the first sentence out too much, put that down later in the story. I'm going to leave this up on the screen so you can see an example of it real quick. The last part of the example, the city's arson investigator concluded Monday, explains the attribution added to this. In other words, that if you're able to put in the story the faulty wiring most likely sparked the blaze, that is a conclusion. How did you know this? How do you know this? If Morgan just says this, if Andrew just says this, well, how the heck do you know this? But if you're able to give that attribution, it gives you more facts from a reader standpoint and makes the story more credible. All right, so I'm going to wind this down, folks. We're almost done. First 5 paragraphs, Julie's going to have a lot of this information for you at the conference to pick up. But when we talk about, when I was a city editor back in the day with the Gannett Company, we talked about the first 5 paragraphs a lot. And we talked about 4 key elements that really needed to be in those first 5 sentences to make sure the story accomplished what it needed to do. What's the news? What's the impact? The human dimension, and that's not a band, folks, that's a quote, and the context. And that really kind of is the story behind the story. The news, like I explained, it's the newest information, the facts, the basics, the most relevant information. What happened? Why did it happen? What's the real story? And what's the reaction? The impact, it means what happens because of this news. What does the situation mean? What should the reader do? Who's affected? What changes because of this? The context, the story behind the story, the perspective, the relationship around the news, a frame of reference. If you're appointing a new squadron commander, and this is the 3rd squadron commander that the unit's had in 6 years, I don't know if that's a good thing or not.
Probably not.
But the context of basically explaining that this is the 3rd time Civil Air Patrol has been called out in the last year, that explains, wow, not only have we had that happen now, we've been used in action for many times over the most recent period of time. So what's normal, what's surprising? What does it mean to the reader? The human dimension, those are quotes. That's getting that voice in the story like we talked about. Quotes give you tension, drama, conflict, hope, humor, outrage, anger. That's color and texture you as a third person writer can't provide. All right, so paying attention to the first 5 paragraphs. This is another one of our Civil Air Patrol stories from the last round of hurricanes. I'm gonna point out a couple of things with you seeing this on the screen. The top paragraph is the news. That's what we've been talking about up to this point, the first paragraph. If you can't sum up the news in the first sentence, then you may not have a news story, and if you don't have a news story, you need to think through, is this really worth my time in pursuing? Single sentence, 28 words. This is what I call the nut. And it's not that I'm calling the commanding general a nut. I want to be very, very clear here. I'm not calling General Smith a nut. I call this the nut graph, though, if we're in my larger class. Sometimes it is basically the story behind the news, the things that you just couldn't get in that first paragraph. The fact that 58,000 members of the volunteer civilian auxiliary of the U.S. Air Force. Again, we're writing this for a broader audience. So explaining who we are up high, not everybody's going to know what Civil Air Patrol is. We do, right? But we have to do that all the time, right? I mean, you know, I've heard you give story pitches to editors saying, well, hey, we're the volunteer civilian auxiliary of the Air Force. Oh. Sometimes that explains who we are and why we're doing. Sometimes it gives them the context that it's just not a club. The nut graph, again, answers questions posed by the lead. The human dimension, there's General Smith's first quote, putting into context the fact that, wow, the lead said to stay safe and stand ready to respond. And he basically is making the point that we have been on duty back to back in natural disasters. First, Hurricane Harvey, now Irma. It tests all of us. He's able to basically say that this is tiring work. We're pushed to the max. Impact. As of Friday, we've delivered more than 300,000 aerial images over Texas and Louisiana. So that is, all of that stuff we did led to that result. That is why we did what we did. That's the detail and perspective. And then finally, some context about the larger situation we're in. You know, the hurricane's about to make landfall. This is where we're going to be in action over the U.S. Virgin Islands. And it just basically, Morgan, and if you really pull this up, this example, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 paragraphs, some of them very short. This is a complete story. There's more to this story, but the reality is, you read this, you get enough, right? And when we talk about media writing sometimes being too complicated, sometimes I feel like I don't have enough time to write a longer story. Sometimes you just need to write 6 sentences. And maybe it's just writing those first sentences out, just telling it like you're telling a neighbor, telling it like you're telling a friend. Why is this important? And sending it to a Morgan or someone that might be able to help you shape that. Because a lot of what we have to do as PAOs is coach people into, you know, helping you shape that story. And you do that a lot, right?
Especially in our wing, we have a lot of units. In our 4 different groups, there's always someone that is kind of looking for guidance at either the group or the wing level. So just making sure they're mentored and they know to keep it kind of limited, but also get everything in the story that needs to be included. Yeah,
and a lot of times as PAOs and as editors, what we're doing is helping you just make the right decisions, winnowing down, because you've got a tendency, you know, we love our stuff. We love our acronyms in Civil Air Patrol. We love explaining our process. And a lot of times our role is to say, well, that's important to us, but maybe to the average reader, they're not going to know what SARX means.
Right. You got to spell it out.
Got to spell it out. You got to say what it is, and you know, they may only want to get down to, well, you know, what did you do and why does it matter, and not the exhaustive detail on some things. Some things they may want great detail. Yeah, I'm reminded of the feature story that you guys put forward in Tennessee Wing about the chaplain who recently departed. What a great guy, but what a compelling story that you were able to kind of coax out of his career and having him tell that narrative. That's a case where a longer story is fabulous because he's got a lot to say, right? But with news stories, sometimes we're just trying to get to the point, kind of a touch and go landing.
Exactly.
So, all right. Hey, look, there you are. So Morgan's on the spotlight right now, and this is something, Morgan, you pulled together I believe this is at the request of our region commander, Colonel
Yes,
Melton.
it was.
And, who said, wow, this is, we got a lot of people here from a lot of different wings. We need to pull this together. So when you were putting this story together, you got a fairly good direction from the region commander there. You led with, had a lot of folks from different wings, right?
So all of the wings represented, and it's multi-wing, but also multi-region.
Yeah. So the reader got, in that case, the fact that this was not just a Tennessee thing, that Tennessee was the heart of this, but there were a lot of people here from different places. But then I noticed you immediately got into, you rather than saying DART in the lead, you didn't say DART in that first sentence. You said it in the second sentence. And you immediately explained what it was before you used the acronym. And I assume that's because you knew your quotes were going to have a lot of DART in it?
Absolutely. I knew that between the incident commander, Colonel Melton, and everyone else involved, they'd just be kind of telling us what DART is, or just explaining DART.
And they're not going to say the full thing all the time, right?
So making sure the reader knew and it was all spelled out in advance.
Yeah, so, all right, let's run the drill on this. So the news was about 50 Civil Air Patrol members, 5 wings, gathered from April 28th to 29th at Tennessee Wing Headquarters for training to hone emergency response skills. So that's your who, what, when, where, and why. The impact is that second graph. In other words, this is exactly what they were learning and why it's important. The context, we talked about all these 5 wings. We had to explain where they are and what they did there at the Tennessee Wing to learn this. And then finally, the human dimension, Colonel Melton's quote, coming together, emerging imagery technology, why this is important. So Morgan, I'll give you an A on this.
Thank you.
That's good. This is good. So we're gonna land this plane by talking about the inverted pyramid. And the inverted pyramid, as you can see from the screen in front of you, it is basically a representation of an upside down pyramid. You think about the pyramids in Egypt, there was something at the, pointy top, small, the base large at the bottom. In most traditional writing, you think about it, you start with something small and it grows and grows and grows till there's a climax at the very end, the whodunit at the end of the mystery. But news writing is not like that. There's no thesis statement, there's no conclusion, and we start with the most important thing at the top, and that's the base of the pyramid turned upside down. The most important thing at the top, and we're putting everything underneath it. It's a little bit less important, a little bit less important, a little bit less important, until we get to the very bottom, and it is probably the least important thing that we wanted to say. The reason why this has been so popular in news writing is that way back when stories were being transmitted by telegraph, and I'm dating myself, Morgan knows nothing of this, when they were transmitted by telegraph, wires would often cut out, communications would cease, and sometimes newspapers and news outlets had to go with the first things they heard. And if it was most important to get that first sentence right, because if the line broke, that'd be everything they had. The Associated Press and the wire, where we're talking about that, is a big origin of the inverted pyramid. So I'm gonna let this sit for a minute or two, let you read over it real quick. You'll see in the graphic, if you can get close enough, we're talking about the 25 to 40 words at that primary lead. That's the who, what, when, where, why. Secondary lead, diminishing order of facts, the lesser details till you get to the bottom. Inverted pyramid also makes it easier to cut a story from the bottom if you're in a news organization. And Morgan sent me 10 paragraphs worth of stuff, but I only have room for 5. I can cut from the bottom typically and still make the story readable. So we're gonna leave this up on the screen for a bit, and this is gonna be a test. This is something that when I teach my media writing class, I ask folks to organize these paragraphs into inverted pyramid order. In other words, A, B, C, D, or E. What's the most important fact? What would you put first? And if you think that letter is the most important, just write on a piece of paper that letter, followed by the next most important, next, next, and next of these 5. So take about 2 minutes. We're gonna have Julie hand out something or do something. You can write this down and collect some thoughts, and we'll be right back. Okay, so we're right back. And hopefully Julie by now has asked you for your opinions on what you thought was most important. Morgan and I are going to share our answers. And Morgan, what did you go with at the top?
E.
E. This is kind of a giveaway. If you heard any of the discussion about the who, what, when, where, why, and how, the Wednesday is the when, and it's in that paragraph, so it's kind of a tripwire. But if you only read E, you understand what this story's about. A followed after that, in my opinion, because it gives you immediate context of how many people were involved and the fact that the letter was processed until they could determine whether the powder was toxic. But the reality is, Morgan, once you get past the E, we could have a debate about what we think is next. I've had some people in my class feel like that C needed to be more important than A. I've had some feel that the fact that none of the workers became ill, maybe that needs to be higher than C. But the least important fact is
Where the mailroom is.
Yeah, where the mailroom is. Now, if it had been in a more important building, it might have been, you might have want to put that higher. But the fact that the mailroom's in the state insurance building, we could make some arguments, but that at least would be my choices. One of the hardest things about teaching a media writing class is that so much of this is subjective. I think this lead is good. Morgan may think it's lousy. And depending upon which one of us is the teacher or the editor or the PAO, sometimes it's going to be the response as, well, I said so. And that's not a very satisfying thing when you're dealing with a classroom situation used to, like a math problem. There's usually only one answer to a math problem. So having basically a good confidence of what you feel is a solid news story and understanding the basics and the groundings and just making sure that you feel that you've represented the facts in a very effective way will get the job done. All right, well, Morgan, we can't really take any questions and answers because this is on video, but any tips or suggestions you want to give to them about your National PAO of the Year advice that you want to give them?
Probably the only advice I would have is, along with the stories, another important aspect is the photos that go alongside that.
Wow.
So making sure that, especially with our relationship with the Air Force now and being a part of the total force and kind of the impact that we have and the visuals that are on us now, making sure that the 39-1 is something that you kind of have in the back of your hand and you have it memorized and at least have it able to be pulled up pretty quickly, because the uniforms and the infractions, making sure that there's no major issues that can't be fixed before the photo's taken.
And you're really good about this, and your squadron, the Murfreesboro Composite Squadron, is fantastic about this. And I guess just to piggyback on top of that, if you are a PAO who's not a uniform stickler, I'm not, you've got to find someone like Morgan who is. And I know we both served under Colonel Bailey, now the National Executive Officer, and she, fantastic eye for detail on this. I know she would the first thing when we would send her things, because I was your assistant PAO, she'd go, hey, no, not this, this, not this, because the uniform isn't right. Paying attention to that detail is important, because not only because we're an Air Force Auxiliary, but we want to take pride in what we do. So that is really good advice. I guess my parting piece of advice is going to be a plug for cap.news. One of the things that you may have heard from your region commanders, from your wing commanders, is that there is an emphasis organization-wide on doing a better job of telling our stories. And then once we tell those stories, making sure we're sharing them with cap.news. cap.news is really the executive news summary of Civil Air Patrol. It is the place where the national commander and the command team turn to find out what is happening coast to coast in our organization. If you're not represented, if your units, if your wings, if your regions aren't well represented on that site, you're not going to be in the eyes and the attention of those who really need to know the good work that you're putting forward. So not only is it good for you as a member of Civil Air Patrol with the higher echelons, it's also an effective way to make sure others outside in the community know the great works that we're doing. Morgan and I pay a lot of attention to social media, and really the proper representation of Civil Air Patrol on social media is critical. And because we care about that, you're starting to see that reflected. Paul's in the audience somewhere here, and I hope he's going to be talking about that soon. But you know, Morgan, we've during our PAO service, we've really talked about why it's important to have good stories and good photos and good representation on social media, because that's how people find out about our organizations, right? And maybe decide to join. Talk about why you feel that's been important in Tennessee Wing.
I feel in Tennessee Wing, and specifically because I'm also a member of a unit, we found a lot of recruitment through our social media posts. So whether it's video, because video is something that's very, it's quick, it's easy to grab, and as long as it's interesting, people are going to watch it. And making sure that you have the subtitles on for the video, because if some people don't play it with sound, that's kind of there. But it's a big recruitment tool, and if people see things that are interesting, or they kind of see something that's local and they didn't realize it necessarily existed, even just a quick boost of the post, paying a couple bucks and making sure you reach out to the areas in your community so that they are aware of Civil Air Patrol. And
posting things on cap.news provides you a good shareable link that you can put on your Facebook pages, your Twitter accounts, and really help tell the stories of your unit and our organization. And my last plea on cap.news is that we can also use that as a press release delivery system. A good story with videos, with photos attached, that is put together with great context that you can forward to a reporter saying, all of this is available for your use. You can cut and paste, build a story off it. I think it gives it a greater sense of immediacy and credibility to a reporter, and I'm speaking that as an old warhorse myself. Well, Morgan and I think we're talked out.
I think so.
I don't think we got any more to say. We're sorry we couldn't make the conference. We hope you have a fantastic conference, and we are always available by email. You should see something at the bottom of the screen with our email addresses. We'd love to talk to you. You can also reach out, of course, to Julie and other members of the National Public Affairs team. Morgan, congratulations to you.
Thank you.
National PAO of the Year.
Thank you.
And thanks for joining us for this conference.